What I'm really going to talk about today is just around cyber threats, potentially impact on reputation, and a little bit about trust. And in the interest of getting you to lunch, I'll try to keep to time. There's no doubt that cybersecurity is front of mind for everyone in our industry, and in fact in every industry. And it's really been escalated to a boardroom level discussion. So in terms of, I'm not necessarily going to go through each of these stats, but when you look at each of these stats that are on the slide and you look at them holistically, it paints a pretty bleak picture about what's going on in the world today. What I really want to talk about from a cyber threat perspective is that hyperbole that Neil actually mentioned and where the focus has actually shifted more recently. When we talk about cyber threats, increasingly I've noticed we've started to talk about the threat actors rather than the what and the how of what happens on our networks from a security perspective. And I think we need to shift that focus back. For the longest time, I've talked about, even when I was in government, about the fact that attribution is really a distraction from what organisations really need to do to implement good security in their environments. And to shift the focus back to what we're actually here for, which is to protect the information and the critical assets that actually underpins the business of the organisation. It's not an IT problem. So I tried to come up with an analogy that made sense to me and to a much wider audience. So this is the first time I've tested this. Happy for feedback later. But I was trying to think of it in terms of what we do from the perspective of when we secure our home or our car from burglary or theft. So when we actually look at, we buy insurance or we fit grills to our windows or we put an alarm system in, we actually don't think about who the burglar might be. We think about what's the value of our assets, how do we protect them, how much coverage do we need. We think about how we might protect those critical assets, things that are irreplaceable to us, the 10 years of photos of our kids as they grew up, and what we actually do to protect that from loss in the event that something goes wrong, whether that be a burglary or a fire or anything else that happens in your home. We start to talk about things like, well, let's digitise all our photos and store them in the cloud. So we start to shift that discussion back from the threat actor, who could come from anywhere, and there are lots of them, and trying to focus on them actually causes more confusion than it does clarity around what we do from a cybersecurity perspective, and shifting it back to the core of what information security, now cybersecurity, whichever term you want to use for it, has always been about, which is protecting the business. We didn't necessarily always call it out, but that's what it's ultimately about. So if we're not going to focus on the threat actors, what do we actually focus on? So what we really need to focus back on is what are the vulnerabilities in our organisations? What are the things we need to actually protect the most? How are we going to protect them? How are they protected now so we can actually form a delta and update and understand what we need to actually do? All of the discussion so far about threats simply serves to scare people. And that's really good if you want them to pay attention. It's not really all that useful when you want them to actually do something to prevent it. So when we talk about this, one of the key things that we really want to focus on is partnering. The sharing of intelligence, the sharing of information. For as long as I can remember, the idea that every person in this room or every organisation in this room would have a cybersecurity incident or compromise and they would share it with everyone else in the room was not existent. It simply wouldn't happen. People were too scared that it would impact their reputation, that it would impact their market share, that it would ultimately result in a loss of competitiveness. We need to get over that and realise that cybersecurity is actually a team sport, and we need to make sure that we're doing that as much as possible. So, picking on Baron, because Neil did. So, if Telstra is the subject of an incident and they've actually really successfully mitigated that incident and know what to do to defend against it, and they're going through that at the moment, what's to say that that exact same incident's not happening in 100 other organisations around the country, and those organisations can also learn from what Telstra's done, or what we've done in Microsoft. I probably should focus on Microsoft. But ultimately it comes down to partnering within industry, partnering within government, and partnering with each other, because ultimately if we're going to make the nation stronger and the nation safer, that's how we do it. And there's a bunch of things, activity that happens, particularly within Microsoft and across this industry that is evidence of that.
The biggest challenge for business today is not competition. It's protecting customer trust.
Every day you read headlines about governments and businesses being hacked, emails compromised, and intellectual property being stolen. That is cybercrime, and it affects each and every one of us. Microsoft created the Digital Crimes Unit to investigate and fight cybercrime. We use the Microsoft Cloud to visualize information so we can track down the criminals. Using our advanced analytics tools, analysis that used to take days to run, we can now see in real time. And we're building what we learn back into the cloud to make people and organizations safer.
When it comes to the cloud, trust and security are paramount.
Our passion is making life tougher for cyber criminals and making it safer for you and your customers.
That video was about the Digital Crimes Unit and what we're doing from a battling cybercrime perspective. There is a specific example I'll talk through. I guess the important thing about this is that, moving more into the reputation space, largely these days, the reputation damage that happens to an organisation as a result of a cybersecurity incident isn't actually because of the incident itself. It's that identification of what they did to respond. And the hindsight analysis, and hindsight's a great thing, of what could they have done to prevent this? Why didn't they do those things that would have prevented this? And it's more focused on how you actually respond, which means you are more prepared, you have to be more prepared to deal with those inevitable incidents. So this one's actually about tech support scams. So no doubt everyone in the room is familiar with these tech support scams. You're browsing a website, there's a pop-up that tells you you've got a virus on your computer and you should call a phone number. So you call the phone number, some people do, and you get someone in a call centre that starts to talk you through how to get rid of the virus, and ultimately they ask you to install some software on your computer so that they can actually remote in and help you. And they all do this for a nominal sum, which they tend to want you to use your credit card to pay for. Or, as I do, as I've received a number of these phone calls out of the blue from the Windows Support Centre telling me that I've got a virus. Now, some people just hang up. Some people play with them, like I do, to try and waste as much of their time as possible, before ultimately telling them that I work for Microsoft and it's probably not a good idea for them to call me again. That doesn't actually work. But in terms of what happened with Microsoft, there was a collaboration between some Microsoft research engineers and the Digital Crimes Unit to look at how we actually track down the perpetrators of these tech support scams, try and get to the masterminds, because they're very good at doing what they do. The guys who build the pop-ups don't know about the call centre guys. They operate on the internet. Sometimes they'll only have an internet address for a day before they find a new one. Trying to track them is really, really hard. So with the benefit of machine learning in the cloud, what those guys did was build a model that was able to identify things like the pop-ups, which, although they appear to never leave your screen, they're actually reloading in microsecond intervals. And what they did was they actually scoured the web for all the websites that actually have these kind of characteristics. So we're talking now about things like indicators of compromise, or the actual attributes of what we call the malicious activity. And then they plugged all that into the machine learning, and they were able to identify all the websites. And then they used our cognitive services, the computer vision API, to actually identify content within the images of the screenshots they'd taken of all these websites. And they identified phone numbers and IP addresses and common threads, which then enabled them to actually reach back and get ahead of the tech scammers. So instead of doing days with thousands of people in terms of the analysis, we're able to really quickly identify what was happening in real time and be able to get ahead of the curve. The other challenge is how you actually represent that data to people after the event. And the graphic on the right there, is not just some random image. It's actually a Power BI dashboard that came out of this actual activity. So if you have a look at, in terms of this, 118,417 events between May 14 and October 16, where tech scams were reported to Microsoft, to the Digital Crimes Unit, and no payment was made. And that's the blue bars on the visualisation. In that same time period, 19,878 where people did actually pay. So people are paying these guys to actually come in and effectively compromise their machine. And that's the yellow bars. So when you start to combine the power of machine learning, Power BI for visualisation, you start to have a real impact, not just on those customers, but the world more widely. In terms of Australia, in terms of where we sit in the globe from a tech scam perspective, 26% have never had an interaction. Find that a little bit hard to believe, but that's 26% who weren't willing to admit it. 62% of people actually ignored the scam. So they either just closed their browser down, they didn't report it. 10%, obviously they continued through with the scam but didn't ultimately end up paying, so they followed the bouncing ball until a point where they said, please give us your credit card details, and that's when the alarm bells went up and they said, no, I'm out. And then, 7%, and then 5% actually lost money. So when you start to look at that and you compare it into the global standard, you can see what's happening. Interestingly enough, the analysts that look at all of this data expect that the numbers are actually far greater than this. At the moment, it's about 10,000 calls per month into the Digital Crimes Unit from across the globe, but that's only the people who report it. So in the interests of, obviously audience interactivity, who in the audience here, has actually had one of these tech scams? And leave your hand up, but who actually reported it? Great, at least we've got a couple. So, for the most part, people close it down, go, that's enough, move on, too much effort to actually call someone. So in terms of what does this actually mean, and what is Microsoft doing about it, and why do we do that? So the Windows support tech scam, it's not actually Microsoft. It's not a problem with our products, it's not a problem with our services, but we're getting 10,000 calls a month. And that's where you start to look at, well, actually that's impacting our reputation. It's our brand that's being used to exploit these end users to actually do these tech scams. And you look at that, so what do we do about it? The tech scam that I recently talked about, that I just talked about, the Free Trade Commission in the US just last month launched a crackdown on those tech scammers to try and actually prevent it from happening. Most of that was based on the fact that we'd already done this work. And that we can actually capture all this data and present it to government and to law enforcement so that they can do something with it, because otherwise it's just too much information for them to consume. And in terms of what we have from an intelligence perspective and a sharing perspective, Microsoft, obviously, as you can see, we have 300 billion user authentications each month into our services. We have 1 billion Windows devices connected each month that get updates. 200 billion emails through our Office 365 and productivity platforms that are scanned for malware. All of that goes into what we call the intelligence security graph that we actually use as the underpinning of most of our security products to make sure that we actually take into account what's happening in the world at large and deliver that back to our customers so that they are in turn protected. Then we look at the Cyber Defence Operations Centre and the Digital Crimes Unit and all the work they do to combat cybercrime, online child exploitation and a range of other fairly nasty things that happen across the world every day. And again, it isn't necessarily because of specifically Microsoft's products on platforms. It's more about what we need to do from a global good perspective. And then we have, in terms of the improved tools, we have this thing called Trusted Cloud. All of our cloud services are designed from the ground up to be secure by design. Security, privacy, compliance, and indeed transparency in how we do that is actually core at everything we do. so that actually our customers, when you consume Microsoft Azure and Office 365 and Dynamics 365, when you actually consume those services, you can do so with the confidence that your data is secure and protected and private. And we provide you with the security tools that enables you to actually examine that, monitor it, manage it, and do it yourself. And ultimately what we're talking about is that very last box on the right side. It's that secure, productive enterprise. So all of you and all of your employees can actually operate in a secure manner, do what you need to do, where you need to do it from, every day of the week. Thanks.
Thank you.